of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 4, 2021, the committee is commencing its study on the environmental contribution of agriculture. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. We have from EnviroStewards, Inc., Bruce Taylor, President. Welcome, Mr. Taylor. And we'll start with EnviroStewards. So, Mr. Taylor, you have the screen.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. EnviroStewards is an engineering company in Elmira, just north of Waterloo, Ontario, but we do work across North America. I'm muted, am I? No, I'm okay. And so what I'd like to outline today is kind of a practical way to get to climate neutral and beyond for the agricultural sector. Our mission is to cultivate resilient business and improve lives. If you're interested, we have a TED Talk on the development work we do in East Africa, but our paying work is in North America. So for example, Maple Leaf Foods is the world's first large food company to be carbon neutral. We got them there in 2019, November. And to do that, we actually assessed 35 facilities with them for conservation measures. And because they pursued a conservation first approach, they're actually saving money instead of costing them money to be carbon neutral. And they're not waiting till 2030, 2040, 2050, they're doing it now. It's actually economically viable to do it now. And so what I'd like to illustrate, first of all, is there's a challenge I see in the typical procurement process. So when people are buying water conservation for agri-food or energy conservation or food loss, typically the tendering is kind of low cost. And so, for example, we did York region, and we did 60 factories for them for water conservation. We saved 36% of the water per factory, including many water, food and beverage manufacturers. But many of the RFQs, you can actually win them by saving 0% of the water. Now, it's much easier to provide a quote to save 0% than 36%. So as a consequence, anybody who's competent actually loses because they're at a competitive disadvantage in the typical tendering process. People think that an energy audit, the best one to get is the cheapest one. The cheapest one will have the most expense when you get to the implementation, because the only way to do it is to implement what's always been done before. And so you'll see in the technical brief I sent also, we did one in London, Ontario, where we can heat the entire arena with the heat they're rejecting now by using a different approach than normal, right? And so what I want to put in your minds is, when you're doing your tendering, it's not the cost of the audit, it's the value of what's found that you need to do. And so there was a bit better attempt on actually agriculture and agri-foods put out an RFP for a food waste challenge. And it was better because it had, here's the amount. So cost isn't the issue. It's who can give us the best proposal, and here's the 3 criteria. And I'll come back to that in a minute on that challenge. But to give a couple examples in the food industry, so Southbrook Winery, they're already LEED Gold certified. They're organic, biodynamic, regenerative, and they had a normal energy audit done. And their normal audit said you can save 5% with a 20-year payback. After that, we found and installed measures that cut the electricity 40% and the gas 40%. Interestingly, he had bought solar panels to replace the rest of his energy. He canceled 1/3 of them. He didn't need them anymore because he's not using that energy, which saved half an acre of vineyard from getting covered with solar panels, right? And so if you just did a cheap audit, you're going to end up with the wrong solution at the end of the pipe, right? And so in their case, it was 4 months, and it's 2 months if you value the wine that would have been lost by covering it with solar panels. And so that's what we're advocating, is this prevention first approach, and it's much more lucrative. And then that gets into the design of these programs. Most of the programs are designed to put money into capital, to basically make unattractive projects attractive, right? So we did one project and under one program, there was $2,500 to assess a factory for what should be done and $500,000 to implement it. So all it did was implement stuff that would have been implemented anyway, because you don't have time to find what you should do. If you take the time to find what you should do, you don't even need the capital funding. Our average payback for everything we've ever done is 1 year. If you find those ones, you don't need the capital. So it's much less expensive to provide the programs. So I'm happy to comment on, kind of design of these programs so you can actually get what you're wanting to buy in the first place. On the social justice, after you reduce as much as you can. So in our own office, we've reduced it 78% per employee, our greenhouse gas footprint, through conservation. To get the last bit, you need to offset that. So what we do is we sustainably offset it. But what are you going to do with that? Most of the programs in Canada are designed to benefit Canadian companies, right? Instead of the people who are suffering from the climate change that we have caused in developing countries. And so, for example, we went to South Sudan and we repaired solar panels on the roof of an orphanage there. And we get twice as much electricity because there's twice as much sunlight in South Sudan. They shut off a generator that used to be running just to run their water pump. So instead of buying fuel for the generator, they buy food for the kids. Socially, economically, environmentally, it's much, much better, but we get zero credit on any environmental program in Canada. We would only get if we put it on our own roof in Elmira, and had limited daylight all winter. And so, we have these X prices for carbon, but the best way to sequester carbon is to just leave it as coal. It's never going to be more inert than that. And yes, planting trees is great. We should do that. But how about not cutting down trees in the first place? When you go to the developing country, they're cutting down the trees to boil the water to make it safe to drink. If you just gave them safe water in the first place, you don't have to deforest, you don't have to, So if we get smart about it, we actually get much better impact on all the sustainable development goals, not just one at a time. On the food loss angle, this is probably your biggest opportunity. So you probably know the big numbers that 1/3 of all the food on the planet is wasted. If it was a country, it'd be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter on the continent or on the world would be food loss after China and the States. Second largest water consumer on the planet is to grow food that's wasted. In Canada, it's $49 billion per year of lost value. Now, almost 100% of the effort has been, how do we divert that from landfill? Because if it gets to landfill, it's going to turn to methane gas. If you divert 100% from landfill, you still waste 1/3 of the food, still the third largest greenhouse gas emitter, still the second largest water consumer on the planet, and you still lose most of that 49 billion. The only way to not do that is to not waste the food in the first place. And there's almost no programs that target that. So we've done Campbell Soup in Toronto, and we first did energy and water with a process integration. We found them $1.6 million per year of energy and water. Then we did food. We found them $700,000 per year of food that didn't have to be wasted. That was going to waste energy plant, but it's 4,000 tons less greenhouse gas to keep it as food because of what's in that supply chain. We leveraged that. Walmart Foundation co-funded us to do 50 audits across Canada. So this was a program administered by CCFI, IA, and Provision Coalition. So we went to 50 factories.
So Mr. Taylor, sorry, the time is up, but you'll get a chance to deal with the question after.
Yep,
so
perfect.
Thank you. We will go to our question round, and first round for 6 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Epp for 6 minutes. You're on, Mr. Epps, for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I'd like to begin with Mr. Taylor, please. My understanding of the ag value chain begins with the suppliers to primary producers, then on to value adders or food processors, then on to our retail sector, either be it through the wholesale or direct retail markets. Am I correct in understanding that your business is primarily focused on only one area, kind of the value adding or the food manufacturers, or do you do any work in primary agriculture as well?
Sure. Yeah, we actually submitted an application under the Agriculture Agri-Food program, the food challenge, that included the Holland Marsh Growers Association, where we've done a bunch of work in the past, and we've previously worked with the Ontario Tender Fruit Growers and others. So we start there, but interestingly, even if you save something in a manufacturing plant, you automatically save it all the way back to the field, right? Because you're making the same output with less inputs. So our scope would be kind of the primary agriculture, distribution, manufacturing and distribution centers is where we make our primary impact, which is about half of the total food loss in Canada is in that wedge.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Lewis for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just the fact that we want to keep asking questions should be testament to the level of expertise on this panel. So I appreciate both the witnesses' time. Thank you. I would address my questions to Mr. Taylor because we've had conversations before. You're actually in the riding of Kitchener-Conestoga, so I can hear in both witnesses the passion and that you bring here, and it's much appreciated. You talk about bringing companies to become climate positive. We've had discussions about having companies that have higher profit margins and smaller footprints at the carbon footprints at the same time, and the levels of innovation they can bring. My initial question would be the scalability of this. Is these procedures, can they work for smaller producers or for large companies as well, as far as energy efficiency, water efficiency, food losses? What's the scalability on this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for Tim. So yes, it works we're doing some right now on a circular food economy demonstration project where there might be half a dozen employees, right up to, Campbell's or Molson's or Labatt's, with thousands of employees. And it's the same thing. It's just the percentages might be the same, but the magnitude gets different. So right now we have an offer in, we did the 50 assessments across Canada. To give you an idea of the scale, if you put a grocery bag beside the CN Tower, another one beside it, you would get to London, Ontario before you ran out of grocery bags every year, just with what we found in those 50 factories. And each of those 50 factories would save $230,000 per year on their operating cost with under 1 year payback, which protects every job in those factories from moving to another country. Right? So the Campbell Soup, we implemented some of the stuff, but before we could implement the rest, they decided to move the factory to a different country. How much harder is that decision if we'd embedded all that and there was 2.5 million additional profit on the books when they're making that decision? So what we need to do is embed this efficiency in the factories, and the best way to do that is to find that efficiency. Invest in finding that efficiency is my advice, whether you're a mom and pop or whether you're a multinational.
And I know I've read some of your research, and you talk about a triple bottom line win, which is operation cost savings, which is job protection, which you just recommended too, and footprint reduction as well. So, but then you also referred to energy efficiency work, and you say it's skewed to the procurement part as far as least expensive opportunity assessments. So in your opinion, that if we focus on least expensive opportunity assessments rather than the most economic environmental benefits, we're not maximizing that potential. So can you tell me about the bit of that paradigm shift and expand on that, how we need to focus on those economic and environmental benefits?
Yeah, basically, you want to look for the value, not the cost of the audit, because the cheapest audit, you cannot find new opportunities. You can only recommend what you've always recommended before, and you can't measure anything. So you actually want to buy that value because that gives you the right answer later on. When you do that, our average payback's under 1 year. And so you want to design the programs, any of them, whether it's food, water, we do them all at the same time because it's much more efficient, right? Because we're in the plant, we minute by minute measure everything and we get the opportunities. But you want to have that step of what should you do versus how to get this done. Because when you get to how it's done, if it's the right thing, you don't even need help to do it. But if it's the wrong thing, you need a lot of help, a lot of expensive help to put that in.
And many of the projects that you referred to, I seem to want to reduce water, reduce energy, and reduce waste.
Correct.
Mostly food waste. Is that the standard that you've been applying to most of these companies?
Correct. Yeah. We also do toxic use reduction, and they all kind of be intertwined too. Where if you reduce toxic, now you need less ventilation, so need less energy. They're all together, and we don't try and tie them apart. We assess them all together. So it's the most efficient way to go about it. But there's no programs that actually are designed around that. So we just kind of cobble together what we can as programs come and go. But I would encourage you when you're doing your programs to think of that conservation is by far. So each of those 50 factories will save $350 for every ton of carbon they avoid without a carbon tax. So that would be on top of that. And so it's actually the most, when you look at your scales, it's plus 100 to minus 100 on the marginal abatement for carbon. The food loss is $350 per ton avoided, right, of savings. And so it's the most lucrative things these factories can do, which then protects those factories' jobs. And then meals, we pitched to do 150 factories across Canada in all the sectors, baking, protein, primary agriculture, vegetables, and whatnot. it would be enough savings to give 2 meals to every homeless person in Canada for 20 years, is the projected savings based on scaling what we did conservatively, assuming we get half as much savings as we did for the first 50. And the government, the federal government, would get $25 of taxes for every dollar they spend on that program. The participating industries will get $19 of additional revenue for every dollar they spent on implementing those things, based on what we've already done at the first 50. And so I'd really encourage you, like, don't delay. We're doing it in the States also. We just did a protein company in Kansas where we cut the total food loss by 30%, which turns into sausage, which is great and makes them more efficient. But why can't we invest this in Canada?
Well, that's what we're studying now. So it sounds practical and affordable. I believe that is my time, Mr. Chair. So thank you.
Pretty close. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Taylor. We'll go now to Monsieur Peron pour 6 minutes. Allez-y, Monsieur Peron.
Go ahead, Mr. Peron. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to begin by thanking both witnesses. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. It's very much appreciated. I'm going to begin with Mr. Taylor. I was really excited to hear about your examples, and you mentioned that it wasn't the cost that we have to look at, but the value. And so could you expound on this further in the framework of government policy, something that we could implement?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So we just actually responded to a challenge from this committee. So they put it out to get 24 things. Unfortunately, we got a letter on Tuesday that we weren't selected amongst the 25. And so I take a really good look at that criteria to see, you know, like what we're going to do. But as far as cost, so that program would have been $2 million, and it would have saved 25 times that on taxes to the government. And so the government themselves would have it would have saved $17 million a year for those facilities, and we had partners across the country. And so I apologize, Yves, I've forgot the original question.
En fait, je voulais que vous nous parliez du coût.
Could you speak to the cost? When you're explaining, it's not the cost of the measures that has to be looked at, but the value that it will bring over the longer term. I think that's what we're trying to get at, to invest over the longer term and to help our agricultural producers to preserve the environment by having incentive programs. And do you have any concrete proposals that you could make? How, as a government, can we help our producers?
Yep. So you have one on the table right now where if you invested $2 million, you would help 150 food and beverage manufacturers across Canada to save enough for 2 meals for every homeless person in Canada for 20 years and avoid 49,000 tons per year of embedded carbon per year, save $17 million for those producers. So over the 20 years, it'd be 460 million meals, and you'd get $25 for every dollar of. So the federal government itself would get $50 million of taxes if the tax rate was 15%. So that's an existing proposal on the table right now, and it's ready to roll out. We have partners. We have the partners on that project: Maple Leaf, Eden Valley, Wellington Brewery, Bimbo, Labatt, Agri-Food, Bondwell, Nature Fresh, Humber College, Holland Marsh Growers Association, Alberta Food Processors, Canada, Food and Beverage Canada, Sustainable Waters and whatnot, right? So
Monsieur Taylor,
it's ready to go. Yeah.
Mr. Taylor, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I have limited time. You also spoke about methane with regards to landfills. And so your program would also limit methane emissions. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct. It actually avoids the problem in the first place. So the food that goes to the landfill turns into methane, but the food doesn't have to go to the landfill in the first place. It should be eaten as food. If you eat that food, you get back everything invested in the supply chain up to that point. The grocery store, the distribution, the manufacturer, the agricultural step. So food is meant to be food. It's not meant to be a resource to turn into something else.
Merci beaucoup, super intéressant.
Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Peron. And now Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for guiding us on this journey with this new study. Mr. Taylor, I'll start with you. I am very interested in the subject of food waste, and it's been really intriguing to listen to the success that you've had with production facilities in reducing their waste. I have a small organization in my riding called the Cowichan Green Community, and they've partnered with local supermarkets to take their food that has gone past its date but is still quite viable. And with a grant from our provincial government, they are repurposing that food and selling it. And they're really just tackling this as much as they can. And then when they get to a point where the food is no longer fit for human consumption, they have partnerships with local farms so it can be used as animal feed, so that a very, very small percentage, if any at all, is left over for the landfill. Now, they are getting close to having this sort of commercially viable. It has taken some government assistance to scale up their operation. But I mean, if we want to replicate that model to other small communities across Canada, do you have any suggestions about what we could include in our report for the federal government?
Sure, yeah. So we're working with one in Guelph right now. So it's Our Food Future, I think it's called. And basically we're working with half a dozen small manufacturers in that town, like a dairy, a brewery, a canning plant, a cidery. And we're finding, so most people, like circular economy is, instead of just making stuff and it ends up in landfill later on, it's how does it form a circle? But most people don't think about the size of that circle. You want that circle size as small as possible. If it's beer, keep it as beer. If there's grain left over, we'll manage that. But, let's first maximize the yield, right? And that's where this food loss prevention, and that's where the highest value is. But then with the residuals, how do you make this ecosystem for that? And so that's a demonstration one right now that the federal government is helping out with. And so that's a model of circular economy, is a buzzword that's growing, I guess. Regenerative is another one, but food loss is a really big one right now. There's a lot of liability. We talk about, feeding the 10 billion people. Well, if you're wasting a third of the food, there's your food right there, right? Let's not burn down the Amazon. Let's just make better use of the food that we're already growing.
I've spoken to some local farmers too, who are trying to set up a system where for any excess manure or rotting food, they're going to put them into tanks and try and capture the methane, because of course unburned methane is a horrible greenhouse gas vis-a-vis carbon dioxide. And they're trying to find a partnership where they can pump into FortisBC's gas line, so that we're using, a quote unquote carbon neutral fuel versus a fossil fuel. Are you aware of any other successful projects across Canada, or anything we can be doing to try and
Yes. There's a whole ecosystem right now of that, and it's a whole ecosystem of how do we take organic waste and manage it. But what we're advocating is how do we take organic waste and prevent it. And that's a missing thing from most programs right now, and it's where all of the social value is, and the economic and the environmental, and it's very overlooked.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And now Mr. Blois for 5 minutes. You're up, Mr. Blois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Taylor, I have about 45 seconds left. What I heard from you, and I'll try to summarize, is we have to, as a government, not only, of course, invest in the types of mechanisms that we're talking about with Ms. Lang, but it's about consulting and just trying to reduce actual food waste. And that alone will help drive a lot of the emissions that might be necessary that could be tied to agri-food businesses and processing.
That's correct. Yeah, it's kind of shocking, but say we did a lobster factory in Nova Scotia, and we just sat our people at the end of the line, and Cody, you're going to do the claws, and Tim will do the tails, and we just sat there, took out the meat that was left. It was over $300,000 per year of lobster. Hey, can we justify hiring an employee for that, right? And if you save that, how much herring do you save to catch that lobster in the first place? So you save it all the way up the chain as soon as you save it. Right? No matter where you save it, even if you save it in your house, you save it all the way back to the fertilizer step.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and thank you, Mr. Blois. Now, Monsieur Peron pour 2 minutes et demie. Allez-y.
Oui, Monsieur Taylor, j'aimerais ça que vous poursuiviez.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, for about 30 seconds, can you expound on this idea of food waste? How can we include this in agricultural processing without hurting the profit line of our business owners? How to improve the bottom line?
Oh, yeah, no, that's a great question. Actually, we average $230,000 per year of savings to the bottom line for 50 factories in a row. And so it's, we do water, we do energy, we do toxics, we do whatever. Food's actually the most lucrative of anything, because they've invested everything to get it right to that point. If it falls off the line 5 feet before the package, if you were able to keep it on the line, basically you've got a market for it and everything. And so it's actually the most lucrative, investment that any of these facilities can make. The this ranged from multinational to small ones, and we averaged 230,000 per factory of additional profit with under 1 year payback. The only difference is they don't know about it. So when we went to Campbell's, they had 200 ideas in their suggestion box, literally. When we did our study, said, yeah, you got 200, but these 7 are what's going to really make a difference for you, which came out to more than 1.6 million or whatever it was. And so it's kind of this strategic thinking that needs to be layered on.
Et comment le gouvernement peut aider le...
How can the government help the agricultural field to go to action? What measures should be passed? What angle should be used by the federal government?
Sure. Well, first of all, throw out waste diversion percentage, because waste diversion looks worse when you save food. Say Campbell Soup, we avoided 1,000 tons a year of food. Their waste diversion number went down because they used to be diverting it. But it's still better to have it as food than as a diverted waste. So we've got the wrong metrics at a federal level, but also there's no programs nobody's even talking about waste prevention of food. We're all talking about organic waste management. How do we destroy this food more efficiently rather than how do we keep it as food? So there's no programs, there's no support for anybody on how to actually go about doing it.
OK. Donc, on pourrait soutenir financièrement ou
So should we support financially those who would take this initiative at the first?
Correct. Yeah. So I would say a co-funded program. So say like the one that's on the table for us right now, we would go into 150 facilities starting next month because it was just declined, right? But we would start next month, go into 150 and help them reduce the food. And that could be a co-funded, so they have skin in the game also. To do this opportunity assessment of what can be done and what's the business case for each thing you would change. So when they get the report, they have the ideas and the business case for each of them. They're ready to go, right? Many of them are implemented before you even leave the factory.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Merci, Mr. Peron. And now Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes. You're up, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Taylor, I'll continue with you. I know from discussions with several farmers in my riding that their electricity bills can be eye-wateringly huge. Here in British Columbia, we're very lucky because, of course, more than 90% of our power is generated by hydroelectricity. But, I'm looking outside at a beautiful sunny day. All of this energy is just raining down from this big glowing orb in the sky. And looking at the price of solar panels, how they have gone down and down and down, they're becoming more efficient. I know you talked about helping a grape grower. And I look at all of that empty space on barn roofs that could be covered in solar panels. For jurisdictions where they are relying on fossil fuels for electricity generation, is this something that is becoming increasingly viable for farmers to participate so that, I know we've got a variable climate. Our winters are not the greatest, but our summers are pretty amazing for power generation. Is this something that we should also be pursuing to help our farmers to really get solar panels on their roofs and on their property?
Yep. No, that's a great question. So on the roofs, I think I would agree with, over the fields, you're losing agricultural output. And so you'd want to be careful with that. But again, like say for Southbrook, it was 7-year payback for the panels, but it was 4-month payback to not use energy. And you can cut a ribbon around a solar panel, but you can't see not using energy. So it's not, doesn't get the same cachet or whatever. But that's actually where the biggest benefit for the farmer actually is reduce that demand. And then all the electricity you're buying is turning into heat eventually.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Are you paying to get rid of that heat from your cooling tower, or can you reuse that heat? So making a whole systems approach. Don't improve one part of it, look at the whole system and then improve that. And then look at renewables for what's left over. Don't start with renewables.
And I know this is under provincial jurisdiction, but has it been a better model for them to feed back into the grid to get a credit, or do you see something better being like a battery storage for them to draw on when the sun isn't shining?
Yeah. So I would say like Southbrook is that net metering, and he's doing it for policy reasons. And before that, there was kind of the lucrative thing that actually brought down the cost of the solar. And so it really doesn't depend how I do it, but I'd really love to see something. What about a program where you actually put panels in South Sudan or Uganda? There's twice as much daylight. You're going to have, all these life impacts. Does it have to be on our roof?
Yeah.
Right?
No, good point.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. With that, I'll thank the panel for a very interesting discussion. We could go on and on, I'm sure. For EnviroStewards, Mr. Taylor, really great to have your statement on what you're doing, and also Nutrien, of course, Ms. Lang, thank you so much. And with that, we'll suspend a few minutes just to change the panel and we'll be right back. Thank you.